I'm Eli Coston. I am an assistant professor in gender, sexuality, and women's studies at VCU. I'm also the associate chair of the department, and I teach a bunch of our courses in LGBTQ plus studies and our trans studies courses. And so I'm here today to talk about the role of LGBTQ rights in an inclusive democracy. And so there are a few considerations that we want to make when we're thinking about LGBTQ issues and their relationship to democracy. And there are certainly more considerations when we're talking about democracy more broadly, but these are kind of the three pillars that I want to focus on with the talk tonight. So number one, the ability to fully participate in society is central to a democratic society, right? But what do we mean, and this is something that these are questions I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we're going through the talk, and things for you to kind of think about and ponder moving forward as well. But what does full participation mean, right? Like, what are the things that you would need to be able to do to say, I am fully participating in society? And there are a lot of questions around that. Number two, when we talk about healthy democracies, right? There are lots of democracies, some of them more healthy than others, but healthy democracies protect the rights of marginalized groups. But this also calls into question which groups should be protected and how should they be protected, right? When we think about the long history of the United States, who we protect and who we say, oh, sorry, rights aren't for you, is a major question, and a question that we return to when we're talking about LGBTQ rights, even today. And also, legal equality reflects the democratic values of justice and fairness, right? But what do we mean when we talk about legal equality? And this is a question that has been central to LGBTQ rights over and over and over again. Are these equal rights? Are they special rights? But we really need to be asking, if we're concerned with fairness and justice, are there instances in which people actually need additional rights or additional supports because they are differently impacted by particular issues and topics, right? And then, especially relevant today, who should decide? Should it be legislators? Should it be the courts? Should it be up to voters to decide these issues, right? In thinking about who gets rights, who doesn't get rights, and how they're protected. So these are the kind of like big questions I want us to keep in the back of our mind. So I'm gonna start with some history about the treatment of LGBTQ people in the US. And some people might think, oh, well, that's over and that's so far in the past, right? That's not today. But I think as we talk about some of these issues, what we'll see is that some of the themes that we see throughout history are actually repeated over and over and over again in this kind of like contested space of LGBTQ people's rights. So we're gonna start way back like 100 years ago, right? And so the progressive era and the roaring 20s. So the progressive era was a time in which there were a lot of social reforms going on, right? You know, people were moving into big cities. This was kind of like part of the peak of early industrialization, right? And so with people congregating together in big cities, what do? You find people like yourself, right? And so more and more LGBTQ people were getting to know each other in these kinds of social spaces and creating social spaces for themselves, right? When you think about the roaring 20s, we're also thinking about a time in which there is a bit of a loosening around a lot of social norms, particularly gender norms, right? You all know about the flappers, right? And how controversial this was, because it was women who were being a bit more sexually assertive, who, you know, were saying, actually, I want to go out and I want to have fun and I want to experience life. I don't want to just have kids and stay at home and be a mom. But this is really challenging for society, right? When you break these kinds of traditional norms. Now, when we think about LGBTQ people, there was also a challenge to those social norms. Prior to this, it wasn't really until the late 1800s that we even had like a particular conception about what it meant to have sex with people of the same sex. In fact, the term homosexuality wasn't coined until the late 1800s. It was just something that some people did, not particularly who you were. But alongside the medicalization of, quote, homosexual identities, right? This meant that we had a group of people that we could identify. So in the 20s, with this kind of flock to large cities, we also see a big boom in what we would think of now as queer nightlife, right? And in major cities around the US, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and we see similar trends also in Europe, right? Because they're experiencing the same type of social revival. But we've got nightlife. We've got things like drag balls. And in fact, there are reports in the early 1900s, right? Drag balls were not a secret. People in Manhattan, for example, white, middle, and upper class Manhattaners were flocking to Harlem to go to the drag balls, literally by the thousands in some cases. We've got newspaper reports about it, right? And so this is really like a pretty dramatic change, right? That the kind of like average everyday person is like, oh, we can go spend our time enjoying these drag balls and nightlife, and then go back to our kind of regular routines during the weekdays. Now, at the same time, LGBTQ people started really kind of like thinking, oh, well, we have these networks now, we need to start organizing for ourselves. And so in 1924, the Society for Human Rights was founded in Chicago by Henry Gerber, the first LGBTQ organization in the United States. And what was really interesting was that as a social organization, they actually applied and registered their group with the state of Illinois so that they could be recognized. Now, the group was incredibly short-lived, lasted only a few months, because after realizing that the society was sending out newsletters about, quote, homosexual issues, the police seized the newsletter mailing distribution list and arrested almost all of the members of the organization. And so this is where we start seeing this kind of push between and tension between, okay, people want to exist in public, but people also want access to particular rights and recognition by the state. And the state is saying, whoa, 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 not that. And then, of course, the Great Depression hits. A lot of this social progressivism fades away. And really, this is where we get a lot of the kind of like anti-homosexual rhetoric in this time period, also a pushback against all the progressivism from the Roaring 20s, those changes in gender roles and things like that, because all of these things are seen as signs of, quote, moral failure. The Great Depression is viewed as punishing society for moving too quickly in terms of social change, pushing those social norms and boundaries, right? So in the 1930s, we get the introduction of the Hays Code. The Hays Code is actually legislation that says specifically that there cannot be depictions of homosexuality, deviance, perversion, other kinds of things like this, particularly in movies, films, television, etc., right? And so this is all a backlash and social response to this idea that the Great Depression is the fault of progressive people like gay and lesbian people, like women who break gender norms, right, or push gender norms. And so this is really the kind of start of the hard pushback by the government against LGBTQ people. Let's fast forward a bit to the 1950s. So the Cold War leads to concerns that communists are infiltrating the US government, right? This is after World War II, and so we're seeing, again, another period of social upheaval. And one of the questions becomes, when we see these periods of social upheaval, who is targeted, who is blamed? So this concern over communist infiltration into the US government extends beyond just potential communists being in the government, right? But the Lavender Scare actually implicates, quote, homosexuals in being perhaps like more persuadable by communists, right? More persuadable to being turned. Because homosexuality isn't particularly accepted, the communists might be able to somehow extort or bribe or coerce people into cooperating with the communist government to give up secrets on the US government, right? And so Executive Order 10450 is also kind of part of the same time period, barring gays and lesbians from government service, right? Now, over this period of time, it's estimated, we don't know exactly how many, but somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 gays and lesbians were dismissed from service in the government. Now, statistically, this might not be inaccurate, right? Given the percentage of gay and lesbian people in the population and also in government service at the time, 5,000 to 10,000 might not be an incorrect number. But the question becomes, were those 5,000 to 10,000 people actually gay or lesbian? And the answer is, we don't know. Because what happens if someone points at you and says, hey, that person's gay? What can you say? How can you refute it? Even if you say you're not, well, you're just lying to cover it up. Even if you're married to somebody of the opposite sex, well, that's just a cover for what you're doing behind closed doors. And so what happened during this time period is really that people who were not wanted in government could then be accused of homosexuality to be ousted from their positions, right? So again, this isn't necessarily about their sexual orientation. This is about who can we scapegoat, who can we blame for this, quote, communist problem, and when it comes to people that we don't like in government service, how can we get them out? Fast forward a little bit further, right? The civil rights era. And so a lot of what we see in terms of government repression during the civil rights era is actually police clashes with gay activists, right? And these were not uncommon. The police frequently raided gay bars and nightclubs, other establishments that LGBTQ people would frequent. And so probably most of you all know about the Stonewall Inn. We're here for part of the kind of Pride Month series. Well, Stonewall happened in June 1969, right? How many people know about the Cooper's Donut Riot? One person. Okay, one person. So the Cooper's Donut Riot actually took place 10 years earlier, 1959. Cooper's Donuts was a place where drag queens, trans people, gays and lesbians, they would go and hang out and drink coffee after, long night drinking. And so the police would show up, not infrequently. They would harass people, things like that. But one night, one of the officers got a little bit rough with one of the drag queens. They decided, hey, we're not having it. And the next thing you know, you have coffee cups being tossed at police officers until they're driven back out into the streets. And the rest is history, right? But not a lot of people know about that because in 1959, it was just a one-off event. This is just something that happened. Yes, the Queens fought back. Maybe they drove the police off for the night. But in terms of the larger history, it didn't have the same ramifications as Stonewall, right? And there were a lot of these skirmishes after 1959 throughout the 1960s. Black Cat Tavern. This happened in San Francisco just a couple years later. And Black Cat Tavern, though, people were tired of the police coming and harassing them. They were tired of being roughed up. They were tired of, just the constant assault on their community. And so this ended up culminating in another one of those kind of small riots in which the police were driven back out on the street. But the difference with Black Cat Tavern is that then LGBTQ people started circulating flyers to have a major demonstration just a short time later to bring about recognition about the abuse that they were experiencing at the hands of the police. This is the first kind of major organized resistance event that we know about during the civil rights era, right? And then, of course, Stonewall Inn happens. Everything is happening in 1969, though. And so that year, a lot of people, regardless if we're talking about the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, 1969 was a little bit of a powder keg, right? And so Stonewall happens, and it's not just one night, but demonstrations continue, and this is really what we tend to think about when we think about the start of the gay rights movement today. In addition to these raids on gay establishments, though, at the same time, we also have to consider that it's not just state repression, it's not just the police, it's not just the government, but it's also collusion with some of our other major social institutions. For example, the police would routinely give the names of the people that they had arrested at gay bars or bathhouses, hand it over to the media to have those lists published in newspapers. Of course, in the 1960s, those people were often summarily fired from their jobs, ostracized from their friends, ostracized from their families. And so this is not just government and state, but this is kind of a more kind of overall campaign of how do we isolate and exclude people, particularly LGBTQ people. Fast forward again, the 1970s. So Miami in 1977 actually enacts legislation barring discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. It is one of the first cities in the entire United States to do so. Anita Bryant launches her Save Our Children campaign at the same time. Y'all notice the flyer here, right? Save our children from homosexuality, with the message being that gay and lesbian people are grooming children, indoctrinating them, tricking them into a gay lifestyle, right? And therefore, we should be discriminating against them because they are a danger to our children. After this campaign, which was not just in Miami, but Anita Bryant ends up taking this as like a larger national campaign, right? So we're hearing this rhetoric all over the United States. But shortly after, the legislation banning discrimination against LGBTQ people is repealed 2-1. Happy to pass it in 1977. People say, oh no, look what the gays are doing. And the city folds, right? And says, actually, yes, discrimination is fine. So, but this messaging, save our children from homosexuality, Who's heard similar rhetoric recently? About what? Drag queens, right? Drag queen story time is now terrible. Trans people are indoctrinating our children. Florida has its Don't Say Gay bill, which would actually suggest that talking about LGBTQ issues at all might in fact influence children, right? And so again, this messaging repeats itself in history. So when we look at modern political battles, we can very much trace the connections to earlier battles. So same-sex marriage, for example. Same-sex marriage, the first couple to apply for a same-sex marriage license in the US was in 1972. And the couple said, hey, you're discriminating against us on the basis of sex because we are two people of the same sex. And the court said, that's so absolutely ridiculous that we're not even going to hear this case. It wasn't until 1990 when several couples sued Hawaii for the right to marry that this became kind of a really big national issue, right? When we think about the US overall, in 1972, nobody cared about that one little case because the court said, that's ridiculous. But in 1990, the Hawaiian Supreme Court said, actually, we think you might be onto something. But it was a split decision. Now, this split decision, though, it sent off the spidey senses of lots of legislators all around the US, both state and federal. And so this led to several states writing legislation defining marriage as between a man and a woman, not in their state constitutions, but just by regular legislation. And in 1996, the federal government jumps in with the Defense of Marriage Act to define marriage federally as being between one man and one woman. And in fact, goes on to say states can recognize the same. Who has a driver's license? A few people. Okay, so how would it be if you got a driver's license here and then drove to one of our neighboring states, let's just say Maryland. You go to Maryland, license no longer valid. Would that work very well? And in fact, there is federal legislation that says that we should recognize documents, right, that come from other states because otherwise that creates those exact same sorts of confusions. What happens if you're married in Virginia and then you move to New York and all of a sudden you're not married? Seem kind of strange? But that was the case for many LGBTQ people because of this particular act and because of later constitutional amendments made by states defining marriages between a man and a woman. So I said that one of the important questions was, well, who gets to decide, right? Yes, there's federal legislation under under the Defense of Marriage Act that says one man and one woman, but states said, we're not sure that's enough. And so we want to amend our state constitutions to define marriage in a specific way between a man and a woman. And so state constitutional amendments require voter referendums, meaning that you get to go vote. You get to say, yes, we agree with this, or no, we don't agree with this. And when left to the states and popular referendums, most states voters decided to ban same-sex marriage, with only 8 states passing laws that would specifically allow it. Who's making those decisions, though? Is it mostly people who are going to be directly impacted by same-sex marriage? Considering that LGBTQ people are a minority of the population, it's mostly heterosexual people who are making that decision for them, right? Now, in 2015, we all know Obergefell v. Hodges legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, meaning that even those state constitutional bans did not apply, right? The federal Supreme Court ruling overrules those state constitutional bans. Now, Supreme Court rulings, are those set in stone? No, they are not, right? We get different justices, they have different opinions, so could that case be overturned? Yes, it could be. And any state who hadn't repealed their constitutional amendment or had other legislation on the books banning same-sex marriage would revert to effectively nullifying those marriages, right? Perhaps people who are already married would be grandfathered in, but there would be a lot of court challenges, right? So again, the question is, who decides? Do voters decide? Does the Supreme Court decide? And particularly when we're talking about a marginalized group in the population, a minority group. LGBTQ people in the military. This is also something that we're hearing a lot about today, particularly trans people in the military. The prohibition on, quote, homosexual conduct in terms of military code dates back to 1951. And in 1994, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was introduced as a piece of federal legislation that was initially actually intended to be a, quote, compromise, saying that gay and lesbian people could serve in the military, but as long as they didn't disclose their sexual orientation. So the prohibition on homosexual conduct remained, but it was supposed to operate as if, well, we're not going to ask about it, and you don't tell us, and then nothing will happen. That's not, of course, what happened in reality. There were over 13,000 service members dishonorably discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And largely, this stemmed from, again, much like the Lavender Scare, other service members saying, hey, my colleague has engaged in homosexual conduct. They should be investigated. But again, there's no way to disprove that you haven't done something. And so when we look at who is discharged, again, thinking about social institutions, thinking about the influence of gender, the military is a masculine social institution. In fact, hyper-masculine. And so when we look at the kind of proportion of people who are dismissed, a far greater proportion of women were discharged from the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell than men. Because they didn't fit in, because they weren't wanted, and because they couldn't prove that they weren't lesbians. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2011. When we kind of look at, other countries, and, part of this was related to the idea of, quote, military readiness and, quote, troop morale. But we knew from other countries that had already accepted LGBTQ people in the military that it didn't, impact troop morale. It didn't impact military readiness. And similarly, when we look to other countries that allow trans people to serve, we find that trans people serve. That they're seen as valuable members of their troops and their units. So trans people, the restrictions on them serving, those were lifted a bit later in 2016. But again, as administrations changed, those have been re-implemented, lifted, and currently re-implemented with trans people being barred from military service currently. There's a host of other things that go along with that, including, for example, trans people being required to detransition if they wish to continue to serve, removal of any gender-affirming care services from military insurance and things like that. Sorry. We also have what are known as Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. And in 1993, again, this is all kind of federal response to the increasing presence of LGBTQ people in public life in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. Federal law that ensures that interests in religious freedom are protected. Interest in religious freedoms being protected often also means that the right to discriminate, if it is a deeply held religious belief of yours, is also protected, right? 28 states have also passed their own religious freedom restoration acts, either through legislation or through court rulings that provide similar types of protections. And so this effectively allows for discrimination against LGBTQ people based on, quote, deeply held religious beliefs, right? And so even states, though, that have banned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation are not necessarily exempt from this federal statute. So for example, Colorado. Colorado has legislation that specifically bars discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. You all might have heard about these two cases, Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, and 303 Creative LLC versus Elenis, the more recent one. Quick synopsis, Masterpiece Cake Shop involved a gay couple who wanted a wedding cake made, and the baker said, no, that violates my religious beliefs. This violated Colorado's anti-discrimination law, and the case ended up going on being very narrowly decided on procedural grounds, but ruling in the baker's favor, saying, actually, no, you have the right to not make that cake. 303 Creative LLC versus Elenis is a more recent case in which a website designer wanted to put a notice up on her website saying, I refuse to design wedding websites for same-sex couples. She knew about the anti-discrimination legislation and so preemptively sued the state because she was afraid that that law would be enforced against her. This ruling was actually a bit broader in saying that website design, much like photography or baking a cake or et cetera, is an artistic endeavor, and you cannot force someone to engage in an artistic endeavor that goes against their deeply held religious beliefs, right? So that broadened it a little bit. It's not procedural now. It's about your beliefs and the thing that you're producing. So this is not the end, because is the end all be all for gay people, wedding cakes, and wedding websites? Certainly not. These types of legislation have also been used by people like medical providers to say, I don't have to provide service to LGBTQ people. In fact, in one case, there was a pediatrician who told a lesbian couple, sorry, this goes against my religious beliefs to treat your child because you are a gay couple. and that's legal under these types of legislation, right? And so fighting for these things is about more than just wedding cakes and websites. It's about fighting over access to things like basic medical care, medically necessary care. Instances in which trans people have gone to urgent cares or emergency rooms, or an EMT and an ambulance had to respond, and being told, I'm not going to treat you because you're trans. So these have widespread major implications for the quality of life of LGBTQ people. And then, of course, we have numerous types of legislation currently impacting LGBTQ youth. Only 20 states actually explicitly include LGBTQ youth in anti-bullying legislation. So there's legislation that says no bullying, but it doesn't specifically protect LGBTQ students from bullying on the basis of their sexual orientation. Was that a hand up, or was that just, okay. Also, 9 states ban the inclusion of LGBTQ issues in the curricula. 12 other states apply additional restrictions. But remember, the Hays Code. We can't show gay people on TV. We can't show gay people in film. And now we're saying, actually, we can't talk about gay people in classrooms. Because if we do, then people will be exposed. And if people are exposed, then they might get ideas. But we know that LGBTQ people exist regardless of whether they hear about or know about other LGBTQ people. They've existed throughout time, throughout history, in every culture, right? 27 states currently bar trans youth from participating in sports aligned with their gender identities. Some states even going as far as, trying to pass laws that would require invasive medical testing, literally genital inspections on youth who are suspected of being trans. Luckily, those kind of worst case bills have not been passed, but nonetheless, the barring subjects students to potential gender verification through other means, right? Or just, if you're accused, you can't play at all. 27 states also banned best practice medical care for trans youth. Recent executive orders have restricted that even further for states that allow it, right? So really what this does is, when we think about the ways that these things intersect, we're talking about LGBTQ youth. Do they have the right to vote? So who's making the decisions for them? Who's going to stand up for them? Is it going to be the courts? Is it going to be voters? Is it going to be legislators? And the answer across the board so far has been no, no, no. When we know from social science research, though, that not hearing about LGBTQ people, not knowing about their own identities, being, forced back into the closet, those things are harmful. LGBTQ youth face incredibly high rates of attempted suicide, right? And we know that one of the protective factors, though, is acceptance, the ability to be themselves. And so this is really concerning. Even things like the same-sex marriage legislation that I mentioned. When we looked at LGBTQ youth mental health, states that passed same-sex marriage bans, LGBTQ youth had poor mental health, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, whereas states that actually passed affirmative laws for same-sex marriage, anxiety was reduced, depression was reduced, mental health was improved, right? So these things do have a major impact. Now, when we're thinking about the kind of like larger issue of inclusive democracies, there's a bigger picture. It's not just the US, right? So I want to show you all two graphics. First, the LGBTQ human rights scorecard. The red areas, these are very bad, right? Very bad for LGBTQ rights. Whereas when we move up, blue places are the best. But we still score about a C in terms of LGBTQ rights. We're not doing our best. Better than some places, certainly. But definitely worse than others. Now, I'm going to show you a second graphic, the Global Democracy Index. And so when we look at the places in red, those are authoritarian regimes. When we look at the places in the dark blue, those are full democracies with a lessening kind of scale in between. I'll go back because I want to know if y'all notice any differences, any similarities between these. LGBTQ human rights. Global democracy. When we look, almost all of the places that are full democracies are supportive of LGBTQ rights. Almost all of the places that are authoritarian regimes are not supportive of LGBTQ rights. And of course, these are not just like two ends of this spectrum. There are lots of in-betweens. But you'll notice that we fall on the in-between in both of these graphics. So why? There are connections between authoritarianism, homophobia, and transphobia. So authoritarian regimes, for example, tend to emphasize traditional values, traditional gender roles, traditional families. They want to go back to the way things were, right? As if there is some idyllic past. Was the past perfect, though? Certainly not. Also, fear of change. So traditional values are not just about, well, we want to keep gender norms the way they are, but it's about the fear of what will happen if gender norms change. What will we do? How will we respond? What's society going to look like then? So when these kind of traditional values change, people who have authoritarian leanings tend to feel upended, uncertain. And that's a scary feeling. I mean, we've all felt uncertain at some point in our lives, right? What's going to happen? What am I going to do next? I don't think most of us are comfortable with that feeling. But that's not necessarily because of change in social values, right? Uncertainty is scary for everybody, but these types of change are scary for authoritarian kind of personalities. Also, the tendency towards preferences for social hierarchy, for social domination. Why? Because there's an established order. It's clear who gets what, it's clear who deserves what. And this is also, to be honest, part of our American ethic, right? Our kind of ethos as a country. You work hard, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and you will succeed. You do X, Y, and Z, and you will get the outcome for your life that you want. Even if that's not the reality, that's, the American dream. But those hierarchies are very clear. Those who work hard get rewards. Those who don't deserve them. Patriarchal power. Men should be in charge. Women should be subservient. Sexuality. Heterosexuality is normal and natural. Anything else is wrong and deviant. And that's very clear. It's very black and white. And so with people with like very rigid kind of authoritarian thinking, that black and white is easy, and it's not scary. Also, scapegoating as a tool for political power. When we look at almost all the countries that rank as pretty highly authoritarian on this map, they have used scapegoating, particularly of LGBTQ folks, racial and ethnic minorities, and/or immigrants, as this is the reason for our social problems. Because if you can blame it on another group, then they're not internal problems. That also results in, well, if we can just isolate those people, if we can ostracize them, if we can get rid of them, then we won't have these problems. So for authoritarian regimes, this is a really powerful tool. If you can convince the general public that this is the problem, and if we just remove the problem, everything's going to be fine, it's very effective. And so we can see, when we look at both the history in the past and our present, how LGBTQ people have also been painted in the same way, right? That if we can isolate the problem, if we can remove it, then everything else will be fine. So I want us to think about, and kind of thinking about this quote, and also the questions I'm going to put up from earlier that we can kind of return to, or other questions is also absolutely fine. But from Marsha P. Johnson, who said, "History isn't something you look back at and say it was inevitable. It happens because people make decisions that are sometimes very impulsive and of the moment, but those moments are cumulative realities." And so we can think about this in terms of both progress or lack of progress, right? We can think about this in terms of the cumulative reality that we want to make, that we are the ones actively making decisions towards that progress, and we can make that our reality. We can also think about this in terms of looking back to the past and how all of the things that have happened before have resulted in the cumulative reality that we're in today, right? So, again, back to those questions to think about. What does full participation mean? Again, maybe we don't care about a wedding cake or a website, but doesn't full participation also require wedding cakes and websites, right? Which groups should we be protecting and how? I didn't get necessarily into all of the kind of intersections that we could talk about, right? Same-sex marriage, great. Largely for white, middle-class, gay and lesbian people. But what about gay and lesbian people who are living in poverty, who are on government assistance, who have disabilities and will lose their insurance if they marry their same-sex partner, right? What does it mean to be legally equal? Well, we could have all the legislation in the world, but will that necessarily end discrimination? And if not, is that enough, right? And what types of additional legal supports do we need for groups who are impacted differently? If we know discrimination is occurring, right, are we any more talking about special rights? Or are we talking about lifting people up so that they're on the same playing field? And then who gets to decide, right? So, I know that was a lot. I covered like 100 years of history in what, like less than an hour, I think. But happy to take any questions, happy to expand more on any of this that you have questions about. Thanks, y'all. Yeah.
To know your thoughts on what it seems like the courts decide a lot of giving people social equity, right? What are your thoughts moving forward? Do you think it lies in the courts, or does it lie with the legislators and voters? Like, just broadly, what do you think?
Okay, so I think that's a complicated question, right? So I think that voter referendums tend to be incredibly powerful, right? Because when the people decide, for example, the people who voted for the states where same-sex marriage was voted for, there's less of a concern about the courts coming back and stripping away a right that was put in place by the majority. I think that we are in an incredibly difficult situation right now in terms of how much power do the courts have? How much power do legislators have? Because that seems to be a pretty big fight these days, right? And so I don't think that there is a single right answer about necessarily who, but I think when we look at it in terms of which of these kind of actions is most powerful would be for like voters to say proactively, no, we want people to have their rights. And historically, I think that has been kind of the strongest and most effective as well. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is very, very, very broad.
Oh.
Gotcha. So this is very, very broad.
It's not working.
So this is very, I mean, this is very, very broad. But as someone who studies this, would you say you are hopeful or not hopeful or somewhere in between, or what does your outlook look? You've looked back. You gave us 100-year history. What do you see the next 10 or 100 years going?
Oh, wow. I have no idea what's going to happen in 100 years, certainly. But I think that one of the things that looking at the history and also thinking about the things that are happening right now today, and my kind of like hopes for the future. I am not going to be the person that's like, it gets better. I mean, the kind of tide of history shows us that things do improve, but it's cyclical. They get better, then they get worse, then they get better.
It's overall trending up.
Yeah, so it generally overall trends up in terms of the arc of history, but I'm not going to pretend that that's rosy. It's difficult and it's challenging. And I think when we look to the history, what we see is that there have been a lot of LGBTQ people who have organized, who have fought really hard to get to where we are today. And when I look at the things that are going around with current federal legislation, what I also see is, despite the, fear that LGBTQ people are experiencing, despite the often hopelessness that they're feeling, they are still organizing. They are still fighting back. And I think that continued momentum is something that is eventually going to continue to move us forward, right? And I think that, again, building on the history, when we look at what was going on in the 1920s, the 1950s, even the 1970s, the kind of infrastructure of these organizations wasn't there. They were, like networks of people or very loose coalitions, whereas now LGBTQ organizations, whether they're, larger national organizations, whether they're grassroots community organizations, are much better connected. And those connections allow people greater opportunity to make change than those kind of more loosely structured networks. So, you know, I think I'm thankful for where we are right now to meet this moment. But, you know, how long it might continue to be hard, where things might go from there, I think it's going to be a long, hard fight for a long time. Yeah. Yeah.
I noticed in one of those maps, Canada is a darker blue than the States. And I think a book exploring how that happened would be of some interest.
Oh, yeah. So, you know, this is in terms of, you know, both, I think actually in both, that Canada is darker. So I think in terms of like the full democracy and participation, that has to do a lot with the social supports that they provide people to be able to participate. And this is just answering very briefly, but I'm sure that there could be an entire book on that. And also when we look at LGBTQ rights, things like anti-discrimination protections being more comprehensive, and things like that are part of what contributes to the higher score.
Well, thank you so much. I would be really curious to hear you talk a little bit about how democracy, democratic norms, and the rights of LGBTQ people, how does that specifically coalesce in Virginia, and kind of how you would talk about and situate Virginia in terms of these intersections?
Okay, yeah. So Virginia is interesting because it's actually changed quite a bit, right? So Virginia was one of those states that passed legislation banning same-sex marriage. But now politically, we're at a place where we're talking about repealing that legislation and actually, you know, having legislation that would enshrine the right for LGBTQ people to be married in the state of Virginia. We're also kind of odd and unique in the South, especially in that we're the only state in the South that does not ban gender-affirming care for trans youth. Now, that doesn't mean that that the executive order by the president hasn't had an impact. It certainly has, in which we've seen a reduction in care for gender-affirming care for trans youth, but it is still legal here, and the only state in the South. And so in many ways, we stand out as slightly more progressive, at least in terms of our state laws. Now, what's interesting, though, is that in many ways, we're also not. So for example, do we include LGBTQ issues in our anti-bullying curriculum? No, we don't. And quite frankly, our state legislators don't want to address LGBTQ issues in schools because that's too sensitive. We've seen school districts in several places in Virginia pushing back against trans students and trans students using bathrooms that align with their gender identity, using their correct pronouns or names of use, right? And so we're in an odd position in which some of the things that deal with LGBTQ rights in Virginia are more progressive, but not all of them. And I think that part of that too is because, you know, we are a state that has shifted politically very recently. And so in those cases, there tends to be a, well, where is it that we're gonna settle? And so I think that some of those things are to be seen. But yeah, we're certainly, in terms of the South, a little bit more progressive, but in terms of the kind of like national context, we're much more in the middle. There are states that are much more progressive, that are, you know, that have more protections for LGBTQ people, while there are certainly many others that have less. Did that answer the question? Okay. Okay. No questions online, right? Okay, great. Well, if that's it, we will wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming. And I can stay around for a few moments if anyone wants to come talk individually, of course. But thank you all so much.